Today we're looking at the beginnings of the Cold War. So the initial few years right after World War II, what are some of the first U.S. policies that come about? So we'll look at things like the Marshall Plan, we'll look at the Truman Doctrine, and we'll kind of see how the relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union kind of get worse. If you've never seen Rocky IV, you need to see Rocky IV. It's all about Cold War symbolism. It's great. We'll talk about it later. Okay, so the beginnings of the Cold War. Let's go back to World War II itself and what's happening there. Before the war's over, you got the three big leaders on the Allied side meeting in Yalta, which is over in the Soviet Union. You've got Winston Churchill, you've got Roosevelt, and you've got Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. They're trying to lay out the plans for what they're going to do after the war. A couple key decisions, things they determine at the Yalta Conference. One, they're going to establish and create the United Nations. That's basically the League of Nations version 2.0. So it's a little bit better. They're actually going to carry through the whole thing. The United States will actually be a member this time, and it won't lead to the failure and collapse like the League of Nations did. It's also going to lead to Germany being divided up into four sections, divided amongst the four major Allied countries. So the U.S. will get a side, Great Britain will get a section, France will get a section, and the Soviets will get a section of Germany. And the idea is, let's kind of rebuild Germany, physically after after World War II, and let's rebuild the government of Germany too. Let's not allow this sort of vacuum for poor governments to kind of take over Germany. Let's not allow the Nazis to sort of regain control. Let's kind of almost like babysit Germany back into prominence and back into being a functioning country again. And then Stalin is going to basically kind of keep control over some of the eastern Soviet-controlled parts of Europe. When the Nazis invaded and the Soviets started pushing back in the war, Stalin's a little bit reluctant to give up those territories. He wants to keep that part of Eastern Europe under his control, under his political influence. And for now, everyone's kind of okay with this. Of course, the United States and Great Britain, they're not super pumped about it, but for now, they're okay with this. So let's talk about the United Nations. Like I said, it's the League of Nations version 2.0. The United Nations is still around today, and essentially the goal is to bring countries together to talk about solutions, to find diplomatic solutions to problems before we get to wars. We've now gone through 2 world wars where alliances and militarism and all these problems lead to these major conflicts. So hopefully the goal of the UN is to prevent those major conflicts. The countries that have the UN flag next to them here, the United States, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, China, these are like countries that have permanent seats on the Security Council. These are like the biggest, largest, most industrialized nations in the world. They get to have a permanent say in the Security Council. There are other members who are part of the United Nations, but they do not play as prominent a role as the Big Six here. And like I said, it's still around today. Its headquarters are located in New York City, and they do other things besides preventing war. They do humanitarian efforts. Countries that are having civil wars, they provide resources, food, shelter, clothing for the refugees. They deal with human rights issues. They condemn slavery, and torture. They try and uphold democratic values like freedom of speech, trying to keep those civil liberties for people around the world to maintain that healthy standard of living. What is the goals of the Soviet Union after World War II? The main thing they want to do, they want to create more security for themselves. They realize that the United States is the other superpower. It's between the Soviets and the U.S., and the Soviets want to make sure that their area, Eastern Europe, kind of remains under their influence. In this map here, you can kind of see Eastern Europe, parts in green. These are where there are heavily influenced areas by the Soviets, either directly or indirectly. And then this red line here represents the Iron Curtain. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, gives this speech talking about how there is this figurative Iron Curtain dividing East and West Europe in terms of political and economic makeup. So everything to the east of the Iron Curtain is going to be under Soviet influence. It's going to be communist in its government, communist in its economic system. And then everything to the west, Germany, Italy, France, Great Britain, that portion, they're going to be heavily influenced by democracy, capitalism, and they're going to be aligned with the United States. So the Soviets want to sort of maintain their control over the eastern portions of Europe, and they want to keep their communist system influential throughout Europe. And eventually they're going to push to go beyond just Eastern Europe. So in response to the Soviets' desire to control Eastern Europe and other parts of the world, the United States creates this broad policy plan or goal of containment. We want to contain, stop the spread of communism. We don't want that to become the most influential political system or economic system around the world. We want to try and get more countries around the world to be more like the United States. We want them to be democratic. We want them to be following capitalist systems. We want more allies aligned with our principles, values, and political systems. So two major containment policies that come up are the Truman Doctrine, 1947. This is President Truman's plan to essentially provide any sort of resources or aid to any country that wants to fight off a communist threat. So the communists are trying to heavily influence anyone and everyone, and then sometimes they're trying to directly coerce people and force them into communist, like direct takeovers. And the U.S. is saying, that's not cool, we're not going to let you do that. We're going to provide resources and money to help you fight off the communists, and in some cases we'll send in our own military to sort of help train or supply those nations to fight off the communist threat. And then a continuation of the Truman Doctrine and this containment policy is the Marshall Plan. Secretary of State Marshall basically looks at war-torn Europe. He does a tour of Europe after the war, and he looks at all the destruction, cities literally laying in rubble and ruins, and he decides that the opportunity for the United States to come in and sort of act as a savior and rebuild all of Europe will help strengthen ties between the U.S. and Europe, and then basically get them to get on board with being our ally and get on board with being a democratic capitalist state, and basically show them like, hey, capitalism, the United States, democracy, this is the way to go. Look, we can literally rebuild all of Europe with our great systems of democracy and capitalism. What are the Soviets doing? They're just sitting there not doing anything to help you rebuild. So the Marshall Plan is a way to sort of help rebuild Europe and strengthen our ties. I like to think of the Marshall Plan, M for Marshall, M for money. That way you'll kind of remember the main goal of the Marshall Plan. Okay, the Berlin crisis. This is going to put U.S. containment policy to the test. We're going to see, how willing is the United States to, provide those resources, provide money. In 1948, you have this situation where Germany, and this map here, it's a picture of Germany. It's divided up into 4 different sections. So this green section represents Great Britain, the blue is French, the orange is the United States, and the red belongs to the Soviet Union. So again, we're trying to the Allied forces are trying to make sure Germany doesn't, become Nazis again, and trying to get Germany back on its feet and help it establish government, and then eventually we'll give it its own independence. And then within the city of Berlin itself, located in the Soviet sector, that city, the capital city, gets divided up amongst the 4 Allied powers too. And Stalin doesn't like the idea of this little island of democracy and capitalism sitting in the middle of the Soviet-controlled portion of Germany, East Germany. So what he does is he's hoping to basically cut off the French and British and U.S. portion of Berlin. He's going to just cut off all the access to the city. He's going to take the railroads out. He's going to cut off all access to roads and waterways, basically choke off the resources to this portion of the city so that he can maintain control over the whole portion of Berlin. Well, the United States, committed to containment, says we're not going to allow the western portion of Berlin to fall into the Soviets' control. So what they do is create what's called the Berlin Airlift. We're literally going to fly in planes, land into the west portion of Berlin, and sometimes drop in supplies, and make sure that they have food and fuel and the necessary resources to basically run a city day to day. Now, why didn't the Soviets just shoot down these planes? Well, we don't want to start World War III, and neither do the Soviets. And so the Soviets can't really justify attacking and shooting down planes that are just trying to provide food. And then a year later, the Soviets basically say, well, this isn't working out. It's making us look bad. So they lift the blockade. They allow access to the roads and railroads to West Berlin again. What this does and why it's significant, it shows that the U.S. is committed to containment. We are committed to stopping the spread of communism. We will do anything and everything to help out our allies. Okay, just to kind of show you again, here's another map. Here's Germany, the 4 different sections. Again, the Soviets, the British, the French, and the U.S. And the yellow section is Berlin. And here's just a zoomed in map of the city of Berlin itself. You can see East Berlin controlled by the Soviets, West Berlin by the rest of the Allied forces, and literally there is a wall surrounding this portion of the city of West Berlin. So all this like pink area surrounding it, this is all in the East German Soviet-controlled side. It's this little island of democratic capitalism. And we'll talk more about this wall later in this Cold War unit. Okay, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, 1949. This is an organization basically democratic, capitalist-aligned countries around the world. They agree to come to the defense of each other. They're going to help each other out. They're going to be trade partners. And if the Soviets should threaten any of these member countries, then the rest of the alliance would come to their aid. So it's kind of like a strengthening of alliances. And in response to NATO, the Soviets create what's called the Warsaw Pact. Whoops. Warsaw is a city in Poland, and Poland is right here, which is, again, these satellite nations, these countries right next to the Soviet Union. Here's the big Soviet Union. All these countries immediately right next to in Eastern Europe, the satellite countries. These are primarily the members of the Warsaw Pact. So this is in response to NATO. The Soviets want to have their own little group of allied countries who will come to their aid should they be under attack from the United States or any of the member NATO countries. And essentially from this point on, from 1949 on, we are stuck in an arms race with the Soviets. When the Soviets first developed their bomb, it puts the Soviets and the U.S. now on even playing field. For a while, for a few years, the U.S. was the only one that had the bomb, and it gave us a lot of leverage in terms of, making demands and trying to contain communism. But once the Soviets develop the bomb, now we're equal. And then also in 1949, the Soviets gain a real powerful ally in China. So China's a big country, a lot of people, a lot of resources, and it just kind of gives the Soviets a little bit of a leg up. So this is kind of a turning point where the Soviets are gaining equal footing and in some regards maybe a slight advantage with aligning with the Chinese. Okay, other domestic issues in the United States, what's going on with the U.S.? We talked about the Red Scare of the 1920s, like with the Palmer raids and how people were freaking out about the wave of immigrants coming in and how the communist revolution of 1917 is creating this panic amongst U.S. society. Things kind of die down a little bit, but after the war, once the Cold War really starts to heat up, now that Red Scare, the second Red Scare we can call it, starts to really heat up again. And one of the main perpetrators of the escalation of this second Red Scare is Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin. He is going to create this big uproar and panic. He's going to talk about this list of all these known communists throughout the government and throughout Hollywood and in the news. And he's basically making all these claims off of nothing. So it's a completely fabricated list. He has no real evidence backing up anything. But because he's a senator, because he's an influential politician, some people listen to him and give some weight to what he's actually saying. This leads to certain restrictions, like people had to give these loyalty oaths. They had to pledge and ensure people that if they want to get a job, you had to make sure that, no, I am not a communist. You had to give this oath and pledge, your allegiance and loyalty to the U.S. So people got so freaked out, and it infiltrated so much of society. It kind of created this panic and kind of paranoia. And it got so bad, like, for example, the Cincinnati Reds. Well, Reds is like a slang for a communist. Well, we can't name our baseball team and call them the Communists, essentially, so they changed the baseball team's name to the Redlegs. And then books like Robin Hood, Take from the Rich, Give to the Poor. You know, that was Robin Hood's thing. They banned that book in certain libraries across the country because taking away from the rich and giving to the poor, that sounds too much like communism. So this fear of communism is infiltrating every part of American life and American culture. And people are really paranoid about, you know, this communist threat, again, infiltrating our government and our society, our way of life. And people are really freaked out for a while. And this is in the early part of the 50s. McCarthy's reign is sort of this rabble-rouser and like guy who's, you know, creating the second Red Scare. It's short-lived, and eventually we start to like call him out on, you know, his list of known communist threats. And by 1954, the Senate votes to censor him. Basically, they can say, "Shut up, dude! Like you're full of it, and you're, you know, doing things here that are illegal. You're basically destroying people's lives. You know, people are losing their jobs because you're accusing them of being communists." So this idea of McCarthyism is named after McCarthy, and it represents this fear, this paranoia of a communist threat and takeover in all parts of American society. If you like movies, check out a couple of modern day movies based off of this idea of McCarthyism, Good Night and Good Luck, and The Crucible. All right, so that's kind of it for the initial phases of this particular lesson. The main ideas here, think of containment, stopping the spread of communism. We've got the Truman Doctrine, we've got the Marshall Plan. Those are the big two initial ones. Examples of containment, how do we back up the Marshall Plan and Truman Doctrine? The Berlin Crisis is the first big test to U.S. commitment to containment. We're going to basically fly in all these supplies to help Berlin not be taken over by the Soviets. And it's going to show and prove that the U.S. is committed to this policy of containment.